I don't normally do vlogs, but there's a lot of confusion around the very dangerous executive order that Donald Trump just signed, which amounts to an attempt to really suppress criticism of Israel and advocacy for Palestinian rights under the guise of combating anti-Semitism. And I think it's important to clear that confusion. So, for starters, I think a lot of the media outlets missed the mark on this one. They were emphasizing what they thought was an attempt by the administration to redefine what Judaism is. And that was simply not the case. Title VI under the Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Education prohibits discrimination on the basis of ethnic characteristics. And this has already been interpreted, rightly by the way, to include Jewish students. Because obviously this protection should be extended to everyone, and that was already pre-existent before this executive order. But what this order does differently is that it expands the definition of anti-Semitism to include criticism of Israel. And that's dangerous because students who are engaged in pro-Palestine advocacy on college campus could find themselves subject to civil rights complaints and civil rights prosecution simply because their advocacy for Palestinian rights was critical of Israel. And obviously that's a real problem to free expression. I want to point out that the new expanded definition of anti-Semitism that is being adopted has a grossly inadequate disclaimer that criticism of Israel that is similar to that of any other country is not considered anti-Semitism. But that really is a laughably inadequate fig leaf. Because that definition goes on to say that demonizing Israel is anti-Semitic, that describing Israel as a racist endeavor is anti-Semitic, and the list goes on and on. So there are obviously multiple problems that come up here. Can we talk about Israeli apartheid, or does that end up saying that you're describing Israel as a racist endeavor? Is any discussion of Israeli apartheid by definition anti-Semitic under that definition? The occupation is clearly a unique case for Israel. No other country in the region has been occupying another people for over 50 years in violation of international law. So can you talk about the occupation? Or is that then considered not similar enough to criticism of any other country and therefore anti-Semitic? And who's to decide what constitutes demonization versus legitimate criticism? This is incredibly subjective. So you can see how there are all these problems that will create undoubtedly a level of, some chilling effect around the ability to have honest conversations about Israel. And then there's also the second question, which is, why the hell does someone's personal political opinion about a foreign country matter in this case at all? I mean, can you imagine a scenario in which the Trump administration announces that criticism of Saudi Arabia could be considered Islamophobic and that students on college campuses have to watch out about how they talk about Saudi Arabia? It would be entirely ridiculous. I mean, the right to have honest conversations and a free exchange of ideas about political issues, that's a fundamental American value that is perhaps the one that is most cherished in our society. And to try to take that away is obviously completely bonkers. It makes absolutely no sense. It is also worth noting that the author of this expanded definition himself, Ken Stern, said that it was never intended to be used domestically and that it should not, because if it were used, it would pose serious risks to free speech on college campuses.
I was the lead drafter working along with my colleague Andy Baker, who did the great politicking of the working definition of anti-Semitism, on which the State Department definition is based. It was drafted, as Rabbi Baker said, with European data collectors utmost in mind, and not to chill or regulate speech on American campuses. The working definition was recently applied to campus in the United Kingdom. Let's see how that worked out. An Israel Apartheid Week event was canceled as violating the definition. A Holocaust survivor had to change the title of a campus talk after an Israeli diplomat complained, and most disturbing, an off-campus group got a university to investigate a professor for violating the definition. In an article she had written years ago, the university ultimately found no basis to discipline her, but the exercise itself was chilling and McCarthy-like.
I also think it's important to note that this is not an accident. It's not an unintended consequence of the executive order. It is actually, the executive order is designed specifically for that outcome. We know that when Trump was introducing this order, he explicitly attacked the BDS movement, which is attempting to do boycotts of Israel as a means of holding Israel accountable for violating Palestinian human rights, where the international community has failed to take action on its own. He was attacking the BDS movement and saying that enacting this executive order was part of the fight against BDS. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, also in defending this executive order, said that Zionism, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. That was part of the justification. So this is clearly intended as a means of stifling criticism of Israel and labeling it as anti-Semitic. And there's an extensive history here that ought to be understood. There's a guy by the name of Ken Marcus who used to bring cases under the Obama administration against the universities that allowed schools, allowed pro-Palestine events to happen on campus, and alleged that these events constitute anti-Jewish harassment and therefore a violation of Title VI. And those efforts were rebuffed repeatedly, thankfully, by the Office of Civil Liberties, the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education under President Obama, which defended students' right to free speech and insisted that these events, political events about Israel, were ultimately protected by the First Amendment constituting free speech, and that they did not constitute a form of harassment against Jewish students. Now, with Donald Trump in power, he has actually placed Marcus himself as the head of the Civil Rights Office at the Department of Education. So the very office that was protecting students' free speech from him, this guy is now in charge of. And he has a clear agenda that he's been explicit about. He said that he's bringing these complaints against students who are critical of Israel specifically to create a problem for them and to create a disincentive, as he called them, Israel haters. He wanted to make sure that they could not recruit students to engage in activities that he considered to be anti-Israel. And that's really what the motivation is about at the end of the day. And he's part of this administration and part of the push for this executive order. There's also other pushes that have been ongoing for years that we've been dealing with. There are a lot of groups that were pushing for something called the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act in Congress, which is really just a version of this executive order, but they were attempting to push it through Congress to expand the definition of anti-Semitism to include criticism of Israel. And thankfully, because of the work of so many civil rights and civil liberties organizations, including the ACLU and even AAI, the organization that I work for, those efforts have actually failed. We were able to put a stop to that because it was blatantly unconstitutional to try to push that through. And now these organizations that were pushing for that, they found an ally in Donald Trump to impose by decree through this executive order what they could not pass through the normal legislative process. So this is what this is ultimately about. And these groups, by the way, were mislabeled by the New York Times as civil rights groups and education groups and so on. But if you look at the actual list, and we have a resource on AAI's website that I can link to in this video, many of these groups actually are ideologically motivated and have engaged in incessant bigotry and anti-Arab and anti-Muslim and anti-Palestinian rhetoric for a very, very long time. So the idea that this is somehow motivated by a concern about anti-Semitism is completely absurd. We know that because, honestly, at the end of the day, this is not just dangerous for free speech, this is dangerous for the American Jewish community as well, and ought to be very disturbing to everyone, because we are living in a time where there's rising anti-Semitism. We are living in a time where deadly anti-Semitism in America is on the rise. We've seen shootings at synagogue. And to exploit this moment and to trivialize the charge of anti-Semitism by throwing it around at people who are critical of Israeli policy is really contemptible at this moment and does not really... So, in effect, anybody who's concerned about free speech and anybody who's concerned about the rise of bigotry and anti-Semitism in our society ought to be very concerned about this executive order. And we should remember, ultimately, that Donald Trump himself has been a huge contributor to anti-Semitism. People should remember that he said that American Jews who do not vote for him are somehow disloyal. He was talking to the Republican Jewish Coalition and said that they like to control politicians with their money and that's why they might not vote for him. I mean, this is really rhetoric that is contributing to the real and rising problem of anti-Semitism, and what is being done here is simply an attempt at quashing pro-Palestine activism and to shield Israel from criticism. And that is incredibly disturbing and is something that should bring all of us together to fight.